He was walking through the forest with his dog when he suddenly noticed an old house among the trees, a house no one in the area had ever heard of. At first, he thought it was just an abandoned place, but when he stepped inside, subscribe to the channel and make sure to write in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning had broken slow and heavy over the outskirts of Greenwood County. A layer of gray mist hovered above the wet earth, curling around the treetops like smoke from an invisible fire. Michael Walker stood on his porch with a cup of black coffee in his hand, watching the steam rise and vanish into the damp air. The world was quiet except for the rhythmic dripping of water from the eaves and the faint muffled sound of his old Labrador, Jack, sniffing at the puddles near the fence. It had rained hard through the night, a relentless southern downpour that had left the soil saturated, the air thick, and the morning oddly still. For Michael, it was the kind of day that demanded a walk, not because it was pleasant, but because silence pressed on him too hard when he stayed inside. He put on his old boots, the ones with the torn laces and cracked soles, and whistled for Jack. The dog trotted over, tail wagging, his fur still slightly damp. Michael took one last sip of coffee and set the cup down beside the worn railing. There was no real plan for the day. There hadn't been one for years. Since the accident, since the divorce, his life had fallen into an uncertain rhythm. Slow mornings, quiet work shifts, long evenings that stretched into nothing. Walking had become his refuge, a way to let the thoughts drain out like the rain that had soaked the ground. Jack was the only constant, the one creature who listened without question, who never asked about the past. The trail began at the back of his property and led into a stretch of woods that ran for miles before giving way to the old highway. The forest had always been there, older than any of the houses nearby, filled with pines and oaks whose roots twisted through the red earth like veins. After a storm, it smelled alive, wet bark, moss, decomposing leaves. Michael liked that smell. It reminded him of something steady, something the world hadn't yet ruined. He closed the gate behind him and started down the muddy path, Jack darting ahead, nose to the ground, tail wagging through the mist. The air was cool but heavy, and droplets still clung to the leaves, falling now and then in slow, deliberate taps. The sky was the color of pewter. Michael's breath came out in faint clouds as he walked. He kept his hands deep in the pockets of his jacket, feeling the shape of the small flashlight he always carried, out of habit more than need. The forest was familiar. He knew every bend, every fallen trunk, every low branch that needed ducking under. He'd walked this path 100 times, maybe more. Yet there was something different this morning. Not just the silence, but the feeling that the forest itself was listening. Jack ran ahead, stopping occasionally to look back as if to make sure his owner was still following. Michael smiled faintly. "Go on," he muttered under his breath, though his voice was swallowed by the damp air. The trail curved down into a hollow where the rainwater had collected, forming a shallow stream that wasn't there yesterday. Jack splashed through it without hesitation, sending droplets flying in every direction. Michael stepped carefully across, his boots sinking into the soft mud with a dull sucking sound. Half an hour passed in the steady rhythm of footsteps and dripping branches. The forest grew denser, darker. The mist thickened. Birds stirred somewhere in the canopy, their calls distant and uncertain. Michael's thoughts drifted to the long-haul roads he used to drive, the miles of asphalt that used to give him a sense of purpose, to the day it all ended, the crunch of metal, the hospital ceiling, the weeks that followed when he couldn't bear to look at himself in the mirror. Life had shrunk after that. From the open highway to a small house, a half-acre yard, and a dog that needed feeding. Some days it felt like penance, others like survival. Jack's bark cut through his thoughts, sharp, urgent. Michael stopped, heart lurching in his chest. The sound came from somewhere off the path, deeper into the woods. Jack barked again, then began growling, low and continuous. "Jack!" Michael called out, his voice echoing faintly. The dog didn't return. The undergrowth rustled. Michael hesitated for a moment, scanning the trees. He knew these woods well enough to feel uneasy. There were old sinkholes, uneven ground, roots that could twist an ankle. But Jack had never barked like that without reason. He turned off the trail and pushed through the ferns and shrubs, the branches scratching at his jacket. The ground sloped downward, the air growing colder, damper. He found Jack standing near the edge of a small ravine, tail stiff, fur bristling slightly. The dog was staring at something below, barking in bursts. Michael moved closer, peering over the edge. At first, he thought it was just part of the hillside that had collapsed from the rain. The soil was dark and loose, dotted with roots and stones. But then he saw it, a flat surface of reddish rock, perfectly smooth, with straight edges that could not be natural. Just beneath it, the outline of something wooden, a frame, maybe, or the remains of a wall. He slid down carefully, grabbing at roots for balance. The slope was slick, and mud smeared his jeans. At the bottom, he crouched and brushed away the wet dirt with his hands. Beneath the grime, old wood appeared, rough, swollen from moisture, but unmistakably shaped by human hands. It was a wall embedded in the side of the hill, its boards held together by rusted nails. Beside it, a narrow window frame, its glass long gone, and a crumbling brick chimney rising out of the earth like a broken tooth. Michael stepped back, staring. It wasn't possible. He'd lived here for years. He'd walked these woods every week. How could he have missed this? Jack whimpered behind him, pawing nervously at the ground. The dog's behavior unsettled him more than the discovery itself. Michael looked around. There were no signs of recent tracks, no litter, no evidence that anyone had been here in decades. The forest had swallowed this place whole. The trees around the structure were thick and tall, their roots pressing down over parts of the wall. He moved closer to what looked like a doorway, a half-rotted plank barely hanging by one hinge. The handle was gone, but there was a hole where it had been. He pressed lightly on the wood, and it creaked inward, releasing a breath of air that smelled of damp stone and rust. The interior was dark, but not completely. A faint, diffused light filtered through the cracks in the boards, revealing the outline of a single small room. Michael didn't step inside. He just stood there, peering in, heart beating faster. The place looked old. Older than anything else around, not a hunter's shack, not a cellar. Something different, a shelter, maybe, the kind of place built to be forgotten. He took a cautious breath and looked closer. There was a table against one wall, or what was left of it, a rusted lantern, the shape of a chair half collapsed. The floor was uneven, covered in layers of dirt and debris. He noticed a faint mark on the far wall, black streaks that looked like soot. He stepped back, running a hand over his chin. Part of him wanted to go inside, to explore, to know. Another part whispered that it was best left alone. The forest had a way of keeping its secrets. But then he thought of the years he'd spent wandering through the same paths, living the same days, feeling nothing. And now, here was something unexpected, something real. A mystery buried beneath his own land. He crouched and studied the ground again, The rain had done this, washed away just enough soil to reveal what lay hidden. If it hadn't stormed last night, he would have walked by none the wiser. Jack barked again, this time softer, uncertain. Michael reached out and patted his head. "It's all right, boy," he murmured. "Just an old place." The words sounded empty even to him. He glanced at the door once more. The smell coming from inside was earthy, metallic, not quite like decay but close. He could see faint scratches on the inside of the door, as if someone had once tried to close it tight from within. He straightened, rubbing his palms on his jeans. The sensible part of him said to leave, go home, call the county office maybe, but the other part, the restless, searching part, told him to come back tomorrow, prepared. He took a few photographs on his phone, the screen flickering slightly in the dim light. The images looked surreal. The red stone, the window, the twisted roots gripping the structure like fingers. He pocketed the phone and began the slow climb back up, slipping twice in the mud. At the top, he turned for one last look. The structure was almost invisible from here, swallowed again by shadow and foliage. It seemed to breathe with the forest as if alive. On the way home, the path felt different. The trees loomed closer. Jack kept looking back, ears twitching. The air was growing cooler as the sun climbed behind the clouds. Michael walked faster, his boots squelching in the wet ground. His mind raced through possibilities. An old settler's cabin, a storm shelter from the war years, maybe even something tied to the mines farther north. But the chimney suggested a dwelling, not a hiding place. Whoever had built it had lived there, at least for a time. And then they'd vanished, leaving no trace except what the rain had now uncovered. When the forest finally thinned and his small house came into view, Michael felt both relief and unease. He wiped his hands on the grass before stepping onto the porch, the smell of wet wood and mud clinging to him. Jack shook himself, sending droplets everywhere, then flopped onto the doormat with a sigh. Michael leaned against the railing and stared back toward the tree line. From here, the woods looked perfectly ordinary, just a wall of green fading into gray mist. No sign of what lay beneath. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd stumbled into something meant to stay hidden. He went inside, made another cup of coffee, and sat at the kitchen table staring at his phone. The photographs glowed faintly on the screen. The more he looked, the more questions rose in his mind. Who had built that house? Why there, buried in stone? How long ago? He zoomed in on the door frame, noticing faint tool marks, the craftsmanship rough but deliberate. Then he looked at the soot on the wall. A fireplace meant warmth. Warmth meant someone had once called that place home. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of wet pine through the open window. Jack lifted his head and gave a low, uncertain growl. Michael turned, following the dog's gaze toward the forest. The sun had already begun to sink behind the clouds, casting long shadows across the yard. He reached over and closed the window, locking it with a quiet click. For a long time, he sat there, listening to the soft ticking of the clock and the distant creak of the porch boards cooling in the evening air. By nightfall, the forest was invisible again, just a dark mass beyond the glass. But Michael couldn't stop thinking about what he'd seen, about the smell of the damp air inside that hidden room, about the faint scratches on the door. It felt less like a discovery and more like an invitation, though from whom or what he couldn't say. As he lay in bed that night, the sound of rain began again, soft at first, then steady, as if the world itself was trying to wash the past back into the ground. But he knew, deep down, that come morning he would return to that place. Whatever it was, whoever had once lived there, their story had waited long enough. He closed his eyes, and in the dark behind his eyelids he saw again the outline of the buried house, the faint red stone glistening under the wet earth. Somewhere in the forest, water dripped, steady as a heartbeat. Jack shifted at the foot of the bed and gave a small, restless sigh. Outside, the storm deepened, and Michael, though exhausted, lay awake for hours, knowing that something had changed, that the forest had finally whispered back. The rain had stopped sometime before dawn, but the forest was still dripping when Michael set out again. He hadn't slept much. The image of that half-buried doorway had followed him through the night, surfacing again and again whenever he closed his eyes. He had dreamed of being underground, of breathing in damp air that smelled like rust and ashes, of something wooden groaning under pressure. When he woke, the sheets were twisted around his legs, and Jack was watching him from the foot of the bed, ears alert. It felt less like morning and more like a continuation of what had begun yesterday. He brewed coffee, packed a flashlight, gloves, and a small folding spade into his backpack, then clipped Jack's leash onto his collar even though the dog rarely needed one. The woods outside looked cleaner after the storm, the leaves gleaming dark green under the low sun. Mist clung to the ground in ribbons, and the air carried that particular chill that follows a long rain. The trail was muddy again, but Michael didn't care. Every step squelched as he followed the familiar path, retracing yesterday's footprints that were already half erased. The forest seemed quieter than before, as if waiting. He noticed details he hadn't yesterday. The smell of crushed ferns, the way light pooled in small clearings, the dark scars on the trees where lightning had stripped away bark. When they reached the hollow, Jack hesitated for a moment and gave a soft whine. Michael unclipped his leash. "Go on," he murmured, and the dog trotted forward reluctantly. The ravine looked almost the same. The slope had dried a little, though the soil was still soft enough to slide underfoot. The exposed section of stone gleamed faintly where the morning light hit it, and the door stood half open, just as he'd left it. He climbed down carefully, gripping at roots and rocks, the spade knocking against his thigh. Jack stayed at the top, circling and whining, his instincts telling him to keep his distance. Michael crouched near the door and took a long breath. The smell was still there, earth, moisture, and something else underneath like old metal. He turned on his flashlight and shone it into the interior. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing a single small room, its corners swallowed by shadow. The floor was uneven, layered with mud and dead leaves that must have blown in through the cracks. A broken chair leaned against the far wall. A wooden crate lay in pieces, its nails rusted to reddish dust. Against one wall stood what might once have been a table, half collapsed, and above it faint marks of smoke where a lamp or a candle must have burned. He stepped inside. The air was cool, almost cold, and thick with the scent of age. The beam of his flashlight wandered across the stone walls, catching on things he hadn't noticed from the doorway. On one wall were faint scratches, vertical and uneven, as though someone had once used a knife or a nail to carve numbers or letters into the surface. He brushed away a layer of dirt with his glove. They weren't words, just short lines, groups of 5, like someone counting days. He counted the groups, 50, 60, maybe more. Someone had lived here long enough to measure time by marks on the wall. In the corner was a small brick structure, blackened with soot. The remnants of a chimney rose through the ceiling and disappeared into the earth above. He crouched beside it, ran his fingers along the cold bricks and found a fragment of metal, the base of an old kerosene lamp. The glass was gone, the top bent. Nearby lay a tin cup, its handle missing, and a few buttons scattered in the dust. None of it made much sense. There were no signs of more recent visitors, no beer cans, no plastic, no footprints other than his own. The place had been sealed by time. Michael stood still for a long moment, listening. The forest outside was distant, muffled, the occasional drip of water echoing through the hollow space. He could hear his own breathing. It struck him that whoever built this place had wanted to disappear. This wasn't a cabin for comfort. It was shelter. Thick walls, a hidden entrance, just enough to survive. He looked at the scratches on the wall again and imagined someone huddled here with a lamp, scratching one mark after another as days passed. The floorboards near the chimney were oddly firm under his boots, less hollow than the rest. He crouched again, sweeping away debris. One of the planks had a different color, slightly raised at one end. He tapped it lightly with the handle of his spade, a dull, solid sound. He wedged the edge of the spade under it and pried upward. The wood lifted with a groan, revealing a narrow gap packed with dirt. Something metallic glinted beneath. His pulse quickened. He dug carefully with his gloved hands until the outline of a box emerged, small, rectangular, its surface eaten by rust. He brushed away the last of the soil and tried to lift it, but it was heavier than he expected. The hinges were fused shut. He could just make out faint letters or initials scratched into the lid, though they were too worn to read. For a moment, he simply stared at it, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Then he exhaled and set the plank aside. He knew he shouldn't take it. Whatever it was, it belonged to someone long gone. But leaving it there, buried again, felt wrong, as if the forest would swallow the last proof that anyone had ever lived here. He hesitated, then slid the box into his backpack. The weight of it pressed against his shoulders as he stood. He gave the room one last look, the soot, the markings, the fragments of life left behind, and then stepped back into daylight. Outside, the mist had lifted and beams of sunlight slanted through the trees. The forest felt different now, not just quiet but watchful, as though aware of what he carried. Jack barked from the ridge, tail wagging nervously. Michael climbed up the slope, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool air. When he reached the top, he looked back. From this angle, the doorway was barely visible, a dark shape at the base of the hill, framed by roots and moss. In a few weeks, maybe less, new growth would cover it completely again. He started the walk home, taking a different path that followed the edge of the stream. The sound of running water filled the silence between his thoughts. The box thudded against his back with every step. He wondered if it was worth anything. An old tool set, maybe, or some relic from the mining days, but the faint marks on the wall and the soot in the fireplace kept returning to his mind. There had been someone here, someone who lived long enough to count time by scratches, who left behind a box and a room that smelled of smoke and metal. When his house came into view, sunlight was breaking through the clouds. He wiped his boots on the mat and went straight to the garage, setting the backpack on his workbench. The concrete floor was cool under his feet, and the smell of motor oil hung in the air, familiar, grounding. He took off his gloves, turned on the small desk lamp, and examined the box. The rust had eaten deep into the surface, but he could see that it had once been painted dark green. It was about the size of a shoebox, made of metal thick enough to survive decades underground. The lid had no visible lock, only a latch that had fused shut. He found an old screwdriver and tried prying at the latch, but it wouldn't move. He sprayed it with lubricant and waited. The metal hissed faintly as the oil soaked in. When he tried again, the latch gave a small crack and lifted. The hinges resisted, then groaned open. Inside, wrapped in what was once fabric but had decayed into threads, lay a bundle of papers, a small wooden box, and something that looked like a pendant chain tangled with dirt. He lifted the bundle out carefully and placed it on the table. The papers were damp but legible. They were letters, handwritten, in looping cursive that spoke of another time. The ink had faded to brown, and the edges of each page were crumbling. The top letter began with a name. Dear James. Michael scanned the lines. It was from someone named Martha, written in 1952. She spoke of the nights that feel longer every week, of keeping the child quiet when we hear voices, of trusting you to bring food next month. His heart tightened as he read. Another letter spoke of fear. They came by again. I don't know if they saw us. The words trailed off where water had blurred the ink. He set the letters aside and opened the small wooden box. Inside was a tiny oval locket, tarnished but intact. When he pried it open, he found a photograph. A man in work clothes smiling faintly, and beside him a little girl clutching a doll. On the back of the photo, written in the same hand as the letters, were the words, "If someone finds this, give it to her. She's still alive." Michael sat back in his chair. The garage felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. He looked around at his tools, the old tires, the neat rows of jars filled with screws. The world of machines and routine seemed distant now, irrelevant compared to the fragile water-stained pages on his table. He reached for another letter. The handwriting shook more here, as if written in haste. They say the river road is blocked. If you don't come by Friday, I'll take her and go. I don't know where, but we can't stay. If this is the end, remember? The rest of the line was gone, eaten by time. He ran a hand through his hair. Whoever these people were, their story was buried here, on his land, their fear preserved in ink and paper. He imagined them. A man named James, a woman named Martha, their daughter hiding in that stone room, counting days on the wall. He could see the faint scratch marks now as human, desperate. This wasn't just an old shelter. It had been a refuge. He looked again at the photograph. The little girl's eyes seemed to meet his, even through the blur of age. "She's still alive," the message said, but that had been written 70 years ago. Could she be? And if she was, what would she think of a stranger finding her family's ghosts? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the branches against the roof. Jack barked once, deep and low. Michael turned off the lamp and sat in the half-light of the garage, listening to the sound. The day had turned gray again, the sun slipping behind clouds. He reached out, touched the letters, and felt a quiet resolve building inside him. He didn't know why, but he couldn't just put the box away and forget it. He gathered the letters into a clean folder, slid the photograph inside, and locked the garage. The walk back to the house felt different this time, heavier, like each step carried a weight he hadn't chosen but couldn't set down. In the kitchen, he poured himself water, staring through the window at the darkening forest. The hidden house was still there, silent under the trees, holding its stories in the damp air. Michael knew he would go back again, not just to look, to understand. The forest had given him something he hadn't known he was looking for, a reason to move, to think, to care. The past, whatever it was, had reached out to him through the mud and rain, and now it was his turn to follow the trail it had left. The following morning rose with a thin veil of fog resting low over the yard, and the world seemed muted, as though sound itself had not yet awakened. Michael stood at the kitchen window with his coffee growing cold in his hand, staring out at the faint line of the forest where the mist pooled thickest. He hadn't slept again. Not really. His mind had replayed the same images through the night. The soot-stained walls, the scratches marking time, the letters written in a woman's careful hand. The small box now rested on his workbench in the garage, the papers spread out neatly beside it. He had read them all, every blurred word, until the ink began to swim before his eyes. He couldn't shake the sensation that he had interrupted something private, something sacred. Yet beneath that guilt lay something stronger: curiosity. A quiet need to know who these people had been and what had become of them. Jack's claws clicked on the kitchen floor as the dog moved restlessly, sensing his owner's tension. The coffee had gone bitter, but Michael drank it anyway, letting the heat anchor him to the present. The house around him was small, plain, white walls, simple furniture, a clock ticking steadily in the corner. But that morning it felt foreign, like he had woken inside someone else's life. The only thing that seemed real was the weight of the past calling from the edge of the woods. By mid-morning, he gave up pretending to do anything else and went to the garage. The letters were just as he had left them, edges curling slightly where the air had dried the last traces of dampness. The photograph lay on top, the image faintly warped from moisture. The man's smile was subdued, tired perhaps, but his arm around the small girl's shoulders was steady and protective. Martha's handwriting on the back. If someone finds this, give it to her. She's still alive, echoed through Michael's head as if she had whispered it directly to him. He touched the surface lightly, afraid to smudge it further. He tried to arrange the letters chronologically. Some were dated, others not. The earliest, from the summer of 1951, spoke of a new start. "James," it began, "the house near the quarry is smaller than I imagined, but it feels safe. We'll manage." The tone was hopeful then, steady. By the following spring, the words had grown shorter, sentences clipped, ink pressed harder into the page. "It's been quiet for 2 nights," she wrote. "The others have moved farther north. I don't know if we should stay." The final letter ended abruptly, a smear of ink where the pen must have faltered. The box had preserved them like a message in a bottle, waiting for someone to find them long after everyone who mattered was gone. He turned the locket over in his fingers. Inside, the small photograph of the girl, perhaps 5 years old, was clearer than the larger one. She was laughing, her hair tied with a ribbon. It felt almost impossible to reconcile that joy with the fear that bled through her mother's words. He wondered if the girl had ever known about the letters, about the hidden shelter. Did she remember the smell of that damp, stone room, the sound of her father's boots on the floorboards, or had those memories faded, buried like the house itself? Michael found himself pacing the garage, the restlessness building. He needed to know more. He needed proof that these people were real, not just ghosts conjured by a forgotten box. The clues were few: names, dates, the faint stamp of a local store on a receipt. Yet that was enough to start. He fetched his laptop from the kitchen and set it beside the papers. The internet was a strange, indifferent archive of lives, but sometimes it yielded miracles. He typed James Johnson, Greenwood County, 1953, and hundreds of results appeared, most irrelevant, some connected to minors, obituaries, census data. He narrowed the search. Greenwood County, missing persons 1950s. Then, Greenwood County mine collapse 1953. A newspaper scan surfaced, its type blurred but legible enough to make his pulse quicken. The headline read, "Local miner feared dead after collapse." The name, James Johnson, stared back at him from the brittle newsprint. Beneath it, a brief note, survived by wife Martha and daughter Clara. Clara. The name lifted something inside him like the first glimpse of light after too much darkness. It wasn't much, but it was a direction. He leaned back, exhaling slowly. Martha's letters hadn't mentioned a last name for her daughter, but now he had one. He printed the article, folded it carefully, and added it to the pile on the table. He imagined the sequence of events: the man trapped in a collapsed shaft, the family fleeing to the woods, the mother leaving behind her letters as a proof of their existence. The idea that anyone might still be alive to remember it all felt almost absurd. Still, Martha's last message lingered. She's still alive. He wanted to believe that meant something more than wishful hope written in desperation. The day slipped away as he dug deeper. He called the county records office, pretending to be researching family history. The clerk, polite but distracted, confirmed that there had been a Johnson family living near the quarry until the early 1950s. The property had been condemned after the collapse of the northern mine. Most of the area was forest now. Michael thanked her and hung up, staring at the notepad filled with names and addresses. He traced the letters with his pen until the ink smudged. When he finally stepped outside, the sun was sinking low. The forest glowed gold and green, peaceful again, as if nothing in it could have ever held sorrow. Jack bounded ahead, tail wagging, eager for a walk. Michael followed, drawn back toward the place that had started all of this. The air smelled of pine resin and damp soil, and somewhere a woodpecker hammered steadily against a trunk. As they neared the ravine, the light shifted, darker, older somehow. He stopped at the top of the slope and looked down. The entrance was still there, unchanged, but it no longer felt like a ruin. It felt inhabited by memory. He descended carefully, this time with gloves and a small lantern instead of a flashlight. The door creaked again when he pushed it open, the sound loud in the hush of the forest. The air inside was as cold as before, thick and still. He placed the lantern on the ground, its light spilling across the rough floorboards. Dust hung in the beam like smoke. He moved slowly, studying each object with the attention of someone entering a sacred place. He ran his hand along the wall where the marks were carved. The grooves felt shallow but deliberate, uneven in height, as though made by a tired hand. 70 groups, maybe more, enough to mark several months of confinement. He crouched by the fireplace again. The remains of the lamp were still there, the handle of the cup, the broken crate. Beneath one of the shelves, he noticed something he hadn't before. A small indentation in the stone, blackened and irregular. It looked like the remnant of a candle or perhaps a bullet mark. He frowned, brushing at it with his thumb. It was impossible to tell. The walls were rough and pitted everywhere, the stone weakened by moisture. Yet the thought unsettled him. He found himself speaking quietly, though no one was there to hear. "You were just trying to live," he murmured, eyes on the floorboards. His voice echoed faintly, swallowed by the chamber. He straightened, listening. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, a soft, shifting sound that might have been words if he'd let his imagination go that far. But Michael wasn't a man for ghosts. He was a man for evidence, for cause and effect. Whatever had happened here could be known, explained, if he only searched hard enough. The lantern's light caught on something near the door, a faint glimmer buried beneath a layer of dirt. He crouched again and brushed the soil aside. A single coin lay there, dull and tarnished. When he turned it over, he saw the date, 1949. U.S. Mint, nothing rare, yet the ordinary object seemed to vibrate with significance. It was proof that this wasn't fantasy. People had been here, eating, sleeping, waiting. He slipped the coin into his pocket and stood for a moment, taken in the room one last time. He imagined the sound of rain hitting the stone roof, the mother and daughter huddled near the small fire, the father maybe never returning. The story was all here, if he could only piece it together. When he left, twilight had fallen. The forest was dense with shadow, and Jack barked softly from above the ridge, impatient for him to reappear. As they walked home, Michael's mind was already turning over possibilities. There might be more buried beneath that floor. Objects, journals, something that told the rest of the story. But tonight he had enough to consider. He had proof of who they were. Tomorrow he would start looking for the daughter if she was still alive. At home, he spread the letters across his kitchen table. Each one carried the weight of a life that had slipped between the cracks of history. He tried to read them again, this time imagining the woman behind the words, the curve of her handwriting, the steady hand that grew shakier as the days wore on. There was strength in her voice even through the fear, a determination to protect her child at any cost. He admired that, maybe even envied it. His own life felt small in comparison, days filled with empty repetition, nights haunted by nothing but silence. Yet now he had a purpose, even if it wasn't his own. He took out the printed newspaper article and laid it beside the letters. The ink was faint but legible. The description of the mine collapse was brief, just a few lines about an accident, a failed rescue attempt, and the assumption that the bodies were unrecoverable. There was no mention of what happened afterward. The world had simply moved on. It struck him how easily entire lives could vanish, erased by time and indifference. If he hadn't taken that walk, if the storm hadn't washed away the hillside, no one would ever have known. That thought unsettled and humbled him at once. The night deepened, the forest outside black now, a solid wall beyond the window. Jack slept by the door, his breathing slow and steady. Michael sat at the table long after midnight, tracing the edge of the photograph with his thumb. The girl's smile seemed brighter in the lamplight. "Clara," he said softly, testing the name. It felt strange on his tongue, like invoking someone who might still be listening. He didn't know what he hoped to find by seeking her out. Maybe just proof that survival was possible, that the story didn't end with that dark room in the hill. Or maybe he simply wanted to see the face of someone who had lived through what he could only imagine. When exhaustion finally claimed him, he fell asleep in the chair. The letters spread out around him like fragments of another world. His dreams were murky, filled with shifting light and the echo of a woman's voice that said over and over, "Remember." He woke before dawn, stiff and cold, the edges of the papers fluttering in the draft from the window. Outside, the horizon was paling. The new day waited, heavy with questions, and somewhere beyond the trees, the past still whispered its unfinished story. The next morning came gray and heavy, with the smell of rain still hanging in the air. The light that seeped through Michael's curtains was pale and cold, the kind that makes the world feel unsteady, caught between dawn and day. He woke before the alarm, heart already restless, the same image waiting behind his eyes. The letters on his kitchen table, the child's face in the photograph, and the words on the back that he could not stop reading. If someone finds this, give it to her. She's still alive. He didn't know what force had driven him into this search, only that doing nothing now felt impossible. He made coffee and watched Jack through the window as the dog wandered along the edge of the yard, sniffing the damp grass. The forest beyond stood silent, hiding its secrets again beneath a film of mist. Michael's mind kept returning to the man in the newspaper clipping. James Johnson, local miner, missing after collapse. There had been no mention of recovery, no follow-up. A single paragraph in a forgotten archive, and that was all. But the family had existed. He had proof now. And if the daughter had survived, then maybe somewhere in this same county, she had grown old, carrying those memories quietly like a scar that never fully healed. He packed the letters carefully into a folder, placed the photograph inside, and drove into town. The roads were slick with last night's drizzle, the fields on either side blurred by fog. The main street was nearly empty at this hour, just a few trucks parked outside the diner, the scent of frying bacon drifting faintly through the air. Greenwood was the kind of town where the past still clung to every brick, where the clock tower had not worked in 20 years, but no one had bothered to repair it. As he passed the courthouse, he caught his reflection in the window. Tired eyes, unshaven jaw, a man chasing ghosts. Still, he kept driving until he reached the old library near the square. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of paper and dust. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a soft voice, looked up from behind the desk. "Help you find something?" she asked. Michael hesitated, then said, "I'm looking for local newspaper archives, around the early 1950s. Greenwood County Chronicle, maybe the Register, too." She nodded, curiosity flickering in her eyes, but said nothing more. Within minutes, she led him to a back room lined with metal filing cabinets and a single microfilm reader humming quietly in the corner. He worked for hours, feeding reels into the machine, scanning grainy headlines that spoke of harvest, small-town fairs, and factory disputes. Occasionally, he found darker stories, house fires, missing persons, floods, but most had no connection to what he sought. The words blurred until his eyes ached. Then, sometime after noon, a headline caught his breath. "Family flees. After quarry fire, house destroyed." The date matched one of Martha's letters. The article was brief, almost dismissive. The home of James and Martha Johnson, located near the northern quarry, was destroyed by fire last night. Authorities suspect arson. Mr. Johnson was not at home during the incident. His whereabouts are currently unknown. Mrs. Johnson and her young daughter are believed to have escaped uninjured. There was no follow-up story, no arrest, no resolution. He printed the page and stared at it. So it was true. The fire, the flight, the fear that lived in those letters. He could almost see it now. The night sky burning orange above the trees, Martha carrying her child through the dark, the smell of smoke on her hands. He folded the copy carefully and slipped it into his folder beside the others. The librarian stopped by a while later, curious about his work. When he explained he was tracing an old family connected to the quarry, she frowned thoughtfully. "Johnson," she murmured. "That name rings a bell. My father worked at the quarry before it closed. He used to talk about a man who disappeared there. Said he was one of the few who stayed behind when things got bad. That would have been 53, maybe? Her eyes narrowed slightly. Why do you ask? Michael hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. Just came across something of theirs, trying to piece together what happened. The woman nodded slowly, as though she understood more than he had said. You might try the county archives, she suggested. They keep old property records, census rolls, even police reports if you know what to ask for. Sheriff's office, too, though they don't like digging through the past. He thanked her and left, his folder heavier now with copies and notes. Outside, the afternoon sun was struggling to break through the clouds. The courthouse loomed across the street, its stone steps worn smooth by decades of footsteps. He crossed over, climbed the steps, and entered the county records office. The clerk at the counter barely looked up until he mentioned the name again. James Johnson, around 1953, something to do with the quarry. That earned him a second look. The clerk, a thin man with gray hair and ink stains on his fingers, tapped a few keys, frowning. Johnson. We've got several, but there's a record here for a property out near Pine Hollow, condemned in '54 after the collapse. Says family relocated, but no destination listed. He turned the monitor slightly. You a relative? Michael paused. Just looking into local history, he said, and the man shrugged. Well, history doesn't pay much, but good luck to you. He spent another hour there, digging through old ledgers until he found what he needed, a list of evacuees from that year. Among them, Martha Johnson and daughter Clara, transferred to St. Luke's Parish Shelter, temporary residence. His pen stilled over the page. Clara again. There it was, proof that she had survived, that they had made it out after all. He copied the address and date, thanking the clerk before heading back into the bright afternoon. The parish building stood on the edge of town, small and plain, with faded white paint and a wooden cross above the doorway. The pastor, a tall man with silver hair and kind eyes, listened patiently as Michael explained he was researching a family that once stayed there in the 1950s. I'm afraid we don't keep many records that far back, he said, but we do have some guest logs in the basement, mostly handwritten. He led Michael down a narrow staircase lined with peeling paint. The air was cool and smelled of old paper and candle wax. Rows of boxes were stacked neatly along the walls. The pastor lifted one labeled 1950-1955 and set it on the table. You're welcome to look. Just put everything back where you found it. Michael opened the first ledger carefully. The pages were yellowed, edges brittle. Most names meant nothing to him, families passing through after floods or layoffs. Then he saw it. March 1953. Johnson, Martha, and Clara, child. Shelter assigned. Room 3B. His pulse quickened. He traced the letters with his finger, as if touching them might bridge the years. There was no departure date, only a note beside it. Transferred to family care. Address withheld. He turned the page, hoping for more, but the next entries jumped ahead to another month. The trail ended there. Back outside, the sunlight seemed too bright. He sat on the church steps, the sound of distant traffic mixing with birdsong. Clara had survived. That was certain now. The question was where she had gone afterward. Somewhere in these same streets, perhaps, she had grown up, gone to school, married, lived a full life without knowing that a man decades later would stumble upon her family's buried refuge. The thought made him smile faintly. History, he realized, wasn't just what was written in ledgers or carved into stone. It lived quietly inside people, carried forward without notice until someone happened to look. By the time he returned home, Evening had settled. The forest at the edge of his property was gold again, the light slanting through the branches. He parked the truck and stood for a moment, looking toward the trees. He knew he'd have to go back to that house in the stone soon. Not to search, but to see it anew, with context now, with meaning. Jack met him at the porch, tail wagging, and followed him inside as he spread the new documents across the table. The pieces were fitting together slowly. The mine collapse, the fire, the hidden refuge, the letters left behind. All that remained was to find the daughter, to close the circle that Martha had started. That night, sleep came easier, though his dreams were vivid. He saw the quarry glowing red under a low sun, men shouting, the ground trembling. He saw Martha's hands covered in soot, holding her daughter close as they vanished into the forest. When he woke, dawn was just beginning to color the horizon, and for the first time in years, Michael felt something like purpose stirring inside him. There was still a long way to go, but now the path forward had a name: Clara Johnson. Somewhere, somehow, she was waiting to be found. The next day rose clear and blue after a week of gray skies. The rain had finally moved east, leaving behind the kind of crisp, brittle sunlight that made the world look cleaner than it was. Michael woke before dawn again, as if his mind had been waiting for the first light to give permission to move. He sat at the kitchen table with the folder of letters in front of him, the edges curling from use, the photograph of the little girl now familiar as an old memory. Clara. The name still felt strange on his tongue, distant yet intimate. Somewhere out there, he thought, she might still be alive. That single possibility was enough to draw him out of bed and back into motion. He started by searching every local directory he could find. Clara Johnson was not an uncommon name, and there were dozens scattered across Mississippi and neighboring states, but only one matched the right age. A Clara Banks, formerly Clara Johnson, living in a small town about 40 miles away. The public records site gave a few spare details: 73 years old, widow, no listed children. There was an address: a quiet residential street near the edge of an old industrial district. For a long while, he stared at the screen, uncertain whether to trust the coincidence. But when he looked again at the handwriting on the back of the photograph, the words seemed to push him forward. She's still alive. By late morning, he was driving down the 2-lane highway that cut through endless fields of cotton and soy. The truck's radio played softly, a static-filled gospel station fading in and out. Jack was in the passenger seat, head resting on the window ledge, eyes half closed. The further they drove, the more the land opened up: abandoned barns, rusted water towers, roads that looked unused for decades. The small town appeared suddenly, tucked between low hills and clusters of oak trees. Its main street was narrow, lined with brick buildings whose signs had long since faded. There was a diner, a thrift store, and a post office that looked too quiet to still be open. He followed the address from his phone until he found himself on a road that curved toward the outskirts, where houses grew smaller and farther apart. Clara Banks lived in a modest one-story home with pale blue siding and a front porch shaded by an overgrown magnolia tree. A faded wooden chair sat near the steps, and a wind chime tinkled softly in the breeze. Michael parked at the curb and sat for a moment, hands on the steering wheel. What exactly was he going to say? That he'd found her family's secret refuge buried in the woods? That he'd read her mother's letters and held her father's photograph? It all sounded absurd, like a story someone invents to fill silence. Yet he knew that not telling her would be worse, that the letters had waited too long already. He left Jack in the truck, promising he'd be quick, and walked up the narrow path to the porch. The wood creaked under his boots. For a moment, he hesitated, then knocked. It took a while before footsteps approached from inside. The door opened a few inches, and a woman's face appeared, framed by the gray hair pulled back neatly. Her eyes, sharp and curious, studied him in silence. She looked older than he expected, but still strong, her posture straight. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady but cautious. "Mrs. Banks," he said quietly. "My name is Michael Walker. I believe I've found something that belonged to your family." Her brow furrowed. "My family?" He nodded and carefully held up the photograph. "This was buried on my property, near Greenwood. I think it's you when you were a child." For a long moment, she didn't move. Her eyes fixed on the photograph, her expression unreadable. Then she pushed the door open wider and stepped onto the porch. The color had drained from her face. "Where did you get that?" He explained as simply as he could: the storm, the hillside, the hidden house built into stone, the letters, the box. As he spoke, she gripped the porch railing, her knuckles white. When he finished, there was silence except for the faint clinking of the wind chime. Finally, she exhaled slowly and said, "You'd better come in." Inside, the house was neat and filled with sunlight filtering through the lace curtains. Family photographs lined the walls, children, grandchildren, holidays, but none older than a few decades. She led him to the living room where a soft armchair faced a small table stacked with books and a half-finished jigsaw puzzle. Michael sat opposite her, the photograph between them on the table. She looked at it again, touching the edge with her fingertips. "That's me," she said at last. Her voice trembled slightly. "That's my mother and father. I didn't know this picture still existed." He opened the folder and laid out the letters one by one. Her eyes widened when she saw her mother's handwriting. "I remember those letters," she whispered. "She used to write to my father even after he stopped coming back from the mine. She said one day he'd find them." She picked one up, the paper fragile between her fingers, and read silently. Her eyes shimmered, but she didn't cry. "She never told me where she hid them. When we left the shelter, we had nothing. I thought everything from that time was gone." Michael listened quietly. He didn't interrupt. The weight of decades seemed to settle around them, the air heavy with memory. Finally, she set the letter down and looked at him. "That place you found, how is it?" "It's small," he said, "half buried now, but the walls are still standing. The chimney, too. You can still see where the bed was, where they marked the days on the wall." She nodded slowly. "My father built it. He said it would keep us safe if things got bad. After the fire, we stayed there for weeks, maybe months. I was too young to keep track. He'd go out at night to find food, and every time he left, my mother would mark the wall. I guess those were the scratches you saw." She looked away, her eyes unfocused. Then one night, he didn't come back. There was an explosion at the mine. We heard it from the woods. My mother, she knew, but she still waited for him every night until we finally left." Michael's throat tightened. The picture of the family he had pieced together through fragments was now a living story, spoken aloud. "I found the letters inside a box under the floor," he said. "They were sealed, like she wanted them to survive even if everything else didn't." "She always believed someone would find them," Clara said softly. "She used to tell me that stories don't die, they just sleep." She smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. I suppose she was right. They sat in silence for a long while. Outside, a car passed slowly on the street, its tires whispering over the pavement. When the sound faded, she looked at him again. "I want to see it," she said. "That place. Can you take me there?" Michael hesitated. "It's deep in the woods, and the ground's still soft from the rain. It might not be safe." "I don't care," she said firmly. "I've waited my whole life to go back." He agreed, though part of him feared what she might feel standing there again. The next day, they set out early, the truck bumping along the back roads that led to his property. Clara sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her gaze fixed on the passing fields. Jack lay on the seat between them, head resting against her arm. "He's a good dog," she said suddenly, breaking the silence. "My father had one just like him." When they reached the edge of the forest, she looked out the window and inhaled deeply, as if recognizing the air itself. "It smells the same," she murmured, "wet pine and earth. I remember hiding in places that smelled like that." Michael parked near the trail and helped her down. She walked slowly, leaning on his arm when the path turned muddy, but her steps were steady. The forest grew darker as they moved deeper in. The sunlight filtered through layers of leaves. Birds scattered ahead of them, and the only other sound was the steady crunch of their boots. When the slope came into view, she stopped and pressed a hand to her chest. "There," she said softly. "That's it, isn't it?" The doorway was still half concealed by roots and moss, the old wood blackened but intact. Michael cleared the entrance with his spade, brushing away the dirt until the opening widened. The smell of damp stone drifted out. He handed her a flashlight, but she shook her head. "I remember it in the dark," she said. Then, taking a breath, she stepped inside. Michael followed her, the air cool and still. She moved slowly, her hand trailing along the wall. "Here," she said, touching the faint marks carved into the stone. "This is where she kept track. Every day my father didn't come back," she added another line. "I used to watch her, trying to count them, but I always lost track." Her voice wavered. "I thought the forest had swallowed this place. I didn't think I'd ever see it again." She knelt by the chimney, running her fingers along the soot. "She used to warm milk on this fire," she said, smiling faintly, "and I'd fall asleep listening to her humming." Then her smile faded, replaced by something like peace. "It's smaller than I remembered." Michael didn't speak. He let her have the silence, the room, the memories. After a long while, she reached into her coat pocket and took out a small envelope. "I brought something," she said. "It's one of her letters I kept. I think it belongs here." She set it gently on the stone shelf beside the lamp base that still lay there. "I want this place to rest now." When they stepped outside again, the afternoon light was softer, golden through the trees. She looked back once, shading her eyes. "He gave his life for us," she said quietly. "My mother always said he stayed behind so we could leave. Maybe now he'll know we didn't forget." On the drive home, she was quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence, full, not empty. When they reached her house, she turned to him before getting out. "Thank you," she said simply. "You didn't have to do any of this, but you did. You gave me back something I thought was gone forever." He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. "I'll keep the place safe," he promised. "No one will disturb it." She smiled. "That's all I could ask." Then she paused, her eyes lingering on him. "You know, sometimes we find things because they're meant to be found by the right person. Maybe my mother was waiting for someone like you." After she went inside, Michael sat in the truck for a long time, watching the light fade across the quiet street. He thought of the hidden house, the letters, the marks on the wall. For the first time since he'd uncovered it, the mystery no longer felt heavy. It felt finished, closed like a book. The forest would keep its silence again, but now it was a silence that carried memory rather than loss. When he finally drove home, the sun had dipped low and the sky burned red behind the trees. Jack rested his head on his knee, and Michael reached down to scratch behind his ears. "It's done," he said softly, more to himself than the dog, but he knew that, in a way, it wasn't really done. Stories like this never truly end. They just settle into the earth, waiting for someone to listen again. The following morning, the sunlight that crept through Michael's curtains was softer than usual, warm and pale, as though the world itself was exhaling after a long, unspoken tension. He woke to the sound of Jack's nails clicking on the wooden floor and the faint scent of coffee drifting from the kitchen. For the first time in weeks, the heaviness that had followed him since that first day in the woods seemed to have lifted. There was still the ache of what he had learned, the weight of those old letters, but beneath it was something gentler, an understanding that what he had uncovered wasn't just tragedy. It was proof that love and survival could leave traces strong enough to outlast time. He poured his coffee and sat by the window. The trees were still wet from last night's dew, glinting like metal where the sun touched them. Somewhere in that forest, the little house carved into the hill still stood, half hidden by moss and memory. It no longer frightened him or filled him with questions. It had become something else entirely, a story returned to its rightful place. But one promise remained. He had told Clara he would make sure the place was safe, that it wouldn't vanish again into the mud and silence. That thought stayed with him as he finished his coffee and looked toward the tree line. By mid-morning, he loaded the truck with a few tools, a hammer, boards, nails, a roll of plastic sheeting, and a small wooden plaque he'd carved the night before. The letters were simple, the carving rough, but they carried the meaning clearly enough. James Johnson, husband, father, remembered. He set it carefully on the passenger seat beside Jack and started the engine. The drive to the forest was quiet, the road winding through familiar fields. Each mile felt like a return not only to that hidden place, but to something in himself that he hadn't realized had gone missing, a sense of purpose, of belonging to something larger than his own solitary life. When he reached the edge of the property, he parked by the fence and shouldered the supplies. The air smelled of pine sap and damp earth, thick with the hush that always lingered after rain. Jack trotted ahead, tail wagging, his fur catching glints of light as he disappeared and reappeared among the trees. The walk felt shorter this time, maybe because Michael knew where he was going, maybe because he no longer felt the same unease. The forest no longer hid its secrets from him. It had offered them up, and he had listened. At the clearing near the slope, he stopped to rest and looked around. The morning light fell in thin, slanted beams through the canopy, painting the ground in streaks of gold. The entrance to the house was almost invisible now, veiled by vines that had already begun to reclaim the disturbed soil. He knelt, brushing them aside until the outline of the wooden frame emerged again. The door leaned forward slightly, as though bowing under the weight of time. Michael set down his tools and placed a small lantern on the ground beside him. "All right, old friend," he murmured to the hill. "Let's make sure you stay standing." The work took longer than he expected. The ground near the foundation was soft, and each nail drove into the damp wood with a muffled thud. He replaced loose boards, patched gaps with tar paper, and covered the exposed sections of the wall with the plastic sheeting to keep out the rain. Every so often, he paused and listened. The forest was alive with small sounds, the rustle of a squirrel in the branches, the creak of trees shifting in the wind, the soft rush of water somewhere deeper in the woods. It was the same sound that had surrounded the Johnson family all those years ago. He could almost imagine them here again, James repairing something by the fire, Martha humming quietly to her daughter, marking another day on the wall. When the entrance was secure, he stood back and examined his work. The structure looked sturdier now, though still humble, still part of the earth. He unpacked the plaque and placed it just above the doorway, pressing the nails in carefully until it held firm. For a long moment, he stood there in silence, hat in hand. "You're home again," he said softly. The words carried easily into the trees, absorbed by the air. Jack barked once, drawing his attention to the path behind him. He turned and saw someone approaching through the trees. Slow, careful steps, a cane glinting in the sunlight. It took him a moment to recognize her, but when he did, he smiled. Clara had come back. She was wearing the same long coat as before, her white hair pulled neatly behind her ears. "I told you I'd make it safe," he said as she drew closer. She stopped a few feet away, catching her breath, and looked at the house. "You did more than that," she said quietly. "It looks almost peaceful." Her eyes lingered on the plaque, and for a moment her lips trembled. "He would have liked that. My father always said he wanted to be remembered for something honest. This is honest." Michael nodded. He built it with his hands. "It's only right that it stands a little longer because of yours." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "When I was a girl, I used to dream that one day someone would find this place and tell me it wasn't all in my head, that it had really happened." She looked at him, her voice soft. "Now I can stop dreaming." He helped her to a fallen log where she could sit, and together they watched the sunlight move across the clearing. She took out a small tin box from her coat pocket and held it out to him. "These are for you," she said. Inside were 2 photographs, copies of the ones he had returned to her along with a new one, a black and white picture of her as a teenager, smiling beside a woman who could only have been Martha. "For the place," she added, "so that anyone who finds it after us will know who we were." He accepted them carefully. "I'll put them inside, maybe in a frame, so they don't fade." She nodded. "Do you ever think about how we find things when we're meant to? Not by chance, but because we're ready to see them?" Michael looked out at the trees, their trunks catching the last edge of sunlight. "I do now," he said. "Before this, I thought the world just happened to people. But maybe it waits for the right person to listen." For a while, they said nothing. The forest seemed to breathe around them, the branches swaying gently overhead. Then Clara reached into her bag again and pulled out a folded piece of paper. "I wrote something," she said. "I don't know if you'd call it a prayer or just a goodbye." She unfolded it, and her voice, though quiet, carried clearly through the clearing. "For the ones who stayed behind, for the ones who built and waited, for those who loved enough to endure. May the earth be kind to you, and may the wind remember your names." When she finished, she laid the paper inside the doorway and closed her eyes. Michael watched her, his chest tightening. There was something sacred about the stillness that followed, the way the forest seemed to pause as if listening too. The air felt heavier, older, filled with the weight of everything that had been left unsaid between past and present. He wanted to tell her how much this moment meant, how much her courage and her forgiveness mattered, but the words didn't come. Instead, he simply stood beside her in silence, letting the forest speak for them both. They stayed until the sun began to sink, the light turning amber and thin. When they finally started back toward the truck, Clara stopped once more and looked behind her. "Promise me you'll keep coming here," she said, "not just for me, but because places like this die when people stop remembering." "I promise," he said. "It won't be forgotten." She smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, her face looked lighter, free of the weight she had carried for so long. As they walked back through the trees, the forest grew brighter, the air filled with the hum of crickets and the distant cry of a hawk. When they reached the clearing where the trail met the open field, she stopped again and turned to him. "I think my mother would have liked you," she said with a faint smile. "You're careful with things that matter." He didn't know how to respond except with a quiet nod. "I think I just got lucky," he said. "Sometimes the earth gives you something it knows you'll take care of." That night, after he had dropped her off and returned home, he sat on the porch long after darkness fell. The sky was clear, scattered with stars that shimmered like dust. The woods beyond his property were quiet now, but he knew that deep inside them, the little house stood secure, its doorway marked, its story safe. He thought of Clara returning to her warm home, of her mother's letters resting once more where they belonged. The story had closed its circle, and yet he felt that in some way it was still unfolding, carried forward by everyone who would one day hear it. When he finally went inside, Jack followed close behind and curled up near his feet. Michael turned off the lamp and sat for a while in the dark, listening to the night sounds outside, the chirping of insects, the faint rustle of leaves. He thought about the marks on the wall of that stone room, the scratches that had once counted the days of waiting. They weren't just a record of passing time, he realized. They were proof of endurance, of hope that refused to die even when everything else had fallen apart. In that sense, the marks belonged to all of them: James, Martha, Clara, and maybe even him. As sleep began to pull at him, he felt an odd kind of peace settle over the house. The forest had stopped being a place of mystery. It had become something else, a keeper of memory, a reminder that even the smallest lives could leave echoes worth finding. Before drifting off, he whispered a quiet promise to himself, to keep tending the place, to make sure it never disappeared again. And somewhere beyond the trees, he liked to imagine that the forest listened, the earth shifting slightly in acknowledgement, as if agreeing to share the responsibility of remembering. The morning that followed was still and golden, the kind of morning that feels like a held breath before something ends. The light streamed through the window and spilled across Michael's kitchen table, glinting off the coffee cup beside a small stack of photographs. He sat there quietly, tracing the edge of one photo with his thumb, the one of Clara as a young girl with her parents standing behind her. It was the same image he had first found buried in the rusted box, but now it no longer looked like a relic from another world. It looked like a promise fulfilled. Outside, Jack barked once at a squirrel and then settled under the porch, his steady breathing a soft rhythm against the hush of the morning. Michael finished his coffee slowly, his thoughts drifting back to the forest. He knew he would go there again today, not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Since that afternoon with Clara, something inside him had shifted. The house and the stone no longer felt like a mystery demanding to be solved. It felt like a friend. Each time he thought of it, he saw it not as a ruin, but as a living piece of the world. Fragile, yes, but enduring. The idea of leaving it behind, letting the forest swallow it again, was unthinkable. And now he had work to do. By mid-morning, he had loaded the truck with fresh boards, a can of varnish, and the simple wooden bench he had built the night before. It was smooth and sturdy, carved from oak, the kind of thing meant to last through years of rain and wind. He planned to set it beside the entrance so that anyone who came there, if anyone ever did, could sit for a while and feel what he had felt, that the past was not dead, merely resting beneath the soil. The drive to the edge of the woods was familiar now, the road bending in ways that had once felt endless, but now unfolded easily before him. The sky stretched wide, cloudless, and the air smelled faintly of sun-warmed pine. When he stepped out, the hum of insects filled the quiet, and somewhere far off he heard the low call of a mourning dove. The sound carried through the trees like a memory. Jack trotted ahead, his tail wagging lazily, disappearing into the undergrowth. The forest felt lighter than before. Perhaps it was only his imagination, but the shadows seemed softer, the spaces between trees more open. The air itself carried a sense of peace. As he walked, he noticed small things he hadn't before. Wildflowers pushing through the moss, new saplings growing in the clearings. Life continued, always filling the spaces left behind. When he reached the slope where the house lay, the sunlight filtered down through the branches in broken gold lines, touching the plaque above the doorway and making the letters gleam faintly. He sat down the bench and rested for a moment, running his hand over the plaque. James Johnson, husband, father, remembered. The carving had dried nicely in the weather. The varnish he'd applied the previous week still held its sheen. He thought of Clara reading her mother's letter there, of her hand resting on the wall where the days had been counted. He smiled faintly. It was a strange thing, how places could hold emotion as if they were alive. The house didn't seem abandoned now. It seemed awake, listening. Michael worked for several hours. He fixed the last of the loose boards and cleared the debris from the path that led to the door. The forest floor was thick with fallen leaves, and as he brushed them away he found small traces of the past. A piece of old wire, a rusted hinge, a fragment of glass that caught the light like a drop of water. Each discovery was like a whisper from another time. He gathered the fragments carefully and placed them in a small wooden box he'd brought, a kind of offering to the history of the place. When he finished, he carried the bench to a spot just in front of the entrance where the sunlight fell evenly through the trees. He pressed it firmly into the soil, testing its balance, then sat down. The wood was warm from his hands, and for a long time he simply listened to the rustle of leaves, the buzz of a distant bee, the slow breathing of the forest. He could hear the faint sound of running water from somewhere below the hill, the same sound that must have echoed here decades earlier. The rhythm of it all was steady and grounding. His thoughts drifted to Clara again. It had been nearly a week since he had last seen her. She had called 2 days ago, her voice calm but lighter than before. She said she was all right, that she'd been sleeping better, that she'd begun sorting through the few old boxes she still had of her mother's belongings. "It feels easier now," she had said, "like the house forgave us for leaving." Those words had stayed with him. Forgiveness, he thought now, wasn't just between people. It could belong to places, too. He stood and looked out over the clearing. The sun had climbed higher, the shadows shorter. It occurred to him that this little corner of the world had once been the edge of someone's universe, the line between safety and fear. And now, after 70 years, it had become a sanctuary again. He imagined others finding it someday, hikers, perhaps, or a family exploring the woods, and wondering who had lived here, why there was a plaque and a bench, why the air seemed heavier but in a comforting way. Maybe they would pause long enough to feel the presence of those who came before. That was all he wanted, for the story to keep breathing. Before leaving, he placed the small box of fragments inside the house, beside the shelf where Clara had left her mother's letter. He stood in the doorway for a long moment, tracing the outline of the walls with his eyes. The carved tally marks were still visible, faint but enduring. He whispered quietly, not out of superstition, but respect. "You're safe now." Then he stepped outside, closing the door gently behind him. On the walk back to the truck, he felt the kind of quiet that lives deeper than silence. Jack ran ahead, chasing invisible scents through the trees, and the forest around them pulsed with life. When they reached the clearing, Michael turned once more toward the slope. From that distance, the house was invisible again, swallowed by greenery. It was how it should be. Hidden, but not forgotten. The following week, word began to spread through town about the discovery. It started with an article in the local paper written by a young journalist who had heard about the lost family refuge through a friend at the parish. She came to see it herself, notebook in hand, asking Michael if she could tell the story. He agreed on one condition, that she treat it not as a curiosity but as a memorial. She did. The article was simple, respectful, the headline plain, "Hidden Shelter Found on Greenwood Property Linked to 1950s Quarry Family." Beneath it, a photograph of the plaque and the bench, sunlight streaming through the trees. Within a few weeks, people began visiting the site. Not crowds, just a few at a time. Teachers bringing students, a local historian with his camera, an elderly couple who had once lived near the quarry. Some left flowers. Others just sat quietly on the bench. Each visitor left something intangible behind. Their presence, their silence, their acknowledgement. The story of the Johnson family, once buried under earth and neglect, had become part of the community's memory again. Michael never sought attention for it. He went about his days as usual, working in the garage, walking Jack, stopping by the diner for coffee. But something in him had changed. He found himself talking to people more, noticing small kindnesses he might once have overlooked. When neighbors asked about the house, he told them simply, it was a place where a family tried to survive. They made it through. That's what matters. And each time he said it, the words felt less like history and more like truth about the present. In early autumn, a small ceremony was held in the forest. The local council had decided to recognize the site as a heritage landmark, not grandly, but officially enough that it would be protected. Clara attended, wearing a simple gray coat, her cane steady in her hand. When it came time to speak, she didn't read from notes. She just looked at the small group of people gathered under the trees and said, "This place saved us once, and now it saves us again by reminding us who we were." Her voice trembled, but her smile was radiant. Afterward, she and Michael walked together to the bench. The air was cool and smelled faintly of rain. She sat down, resting her hands on the smooth wood. "It feels like peace here," she said. He nodded. "It is." She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it lightly. "Thank you, Michael. You gave my family back its place in the world." He shook his head. "No, the world just waited for you to come home." As evening fell and the last of the visitors drifted away, Michael stayed behind. The light through the trees turned amber, and the forest hummed softly, as though alive with gratitude. He sat on the bench, Jack lying beside him, and watched the sky darken. The air cooled, carrying the faint scent of wood smoke from somewhere far off. He thought of all that had happened, the discovery, the letters, the voices that had risen again after so many years, and felt something deep inside settle into stillness. By the time he stood to leave, the first stars had appeared between the branches. He looked back one last time at the small door in the hillside, now barely visible in the twilight. The plaque caught the last glimmer of light, a golden flash that faded as night took hold. He smiled and whispered, "Rest easy." On the drive home, the world felt wide and open. The road shimmered faintly under the moonlight, and the trees on either side swayed gently in the wind. When he reached his house, he turned off the headlights and sat for a while, listening to the crickets. The story was finished, but it would never truly end. It would live in the wind that passed through the trees, in the quiet footsteps of anyone who wandered that forest and paused to wonder who had come before. Inside, the house felt warm. Jack curled up by the door, sighing contentedly. Michael poured himself one last cup of coffee and stepped onto the porch. The stars above were sharp and clear, the kind of stars that made time feel smaller. He thought of the inscription on the plaque, of the lives it represented, and of how, in the end, all people wanted the same thing, to be remembered with kindness. He lifted the cup to his lips, the steam rising into the cool night air. Somewhere beyond the trees, a faint breeze stirred the leaves, carrying with it the scent of pine and the whisper of old voices at peace. And for the first time in years, Michael felt entirely still, as though the world and he were finally breathing in rhythm. The house and the stone, the family who had built it, the forest that had kept their secret, all of it had found its rest. And in their quiet endurance, he had found his own. Before you go, don't forget, stories like this one are just the beginning. Hit subscribe right now so you never miss the next discovery waiting to be uncovered. Turn on notifications, share this video with your friends, and tell us in the comments what you think about Michael's journey and the secrets hidden in the forest. Stay tuned for the next episode. And remember, sometimes the past doesn't stay buried forever.